Watch this vidcast or I'll gouge your eyes out.
Welcome back, Horror Hounds, to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
I'm Mike Ghostman Pickle.
And I'm James Rivera. Today we have an interview with David Gregory, co-founder of SEVERIN Films, prolific documentarian in horror and genre films, and a filmmaker in his own right with the cult classic Plague Town.
This guy is one fascinating individual with a huge, successful career, very interesting. So check this out. We hope you guys enjoy it.
Horror Show exclusive.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce the co-creator of SEVERIN Films and also the director of one of my favorite horror films, Plague Town, and several fascinating filmmaking documentaries. Ladies and gentlemen, David Gregory.
Hello.
How you doing today, David?
I'm doing very well, thank you, considering. Are you in lockdown right now, or are you... Yes, I am in lockdown. I am basically, me and my girlfriend have basically come out to a house in the desert in Joshua Tree, far away from Los Angeles. But for the most part, we've just been working from home in Los Angeles.
You grew up in Nottingham, UK, am I correct?
Correct, yes.
How was your childhood growing up? What was it like growing up?
It was fine. Nottingham's, I think, like the 7th biggest city in England, and it was a fine place to grow up. But me and most of my friends left there after we graduated high school and never went back. I go back to visit family every now and then, but I left to go to the US, and that was that.
What first inspired you to get into filmmaking?
I've been a monster and horror movie fan as long as I can remember, since my parents took me to see King Kong, the one with Jessica Lange and Jeff Bridges, not the 1933 one, when I was, I think, 4 years old, and made an enormous impact. And I've been into monsters and horror ever since. And I grew up during the early video era. So I just became a film fanatic. I mean, that was what I was obsessed with. But I also started, making films with the parents' Super 8 camera with friends and stuff like that. Taking instruments from the garage and chopping each other up with tomato ketchup and all that kind of thing. The usual story. So
you knew from a young age then that you were going to be a filmmaker, I'm guessing?
That was the hope, yes.
Okay.
Although it wasn't particularly encouraged in my high school. I mean, that was something that the people didn't actually do for a living in Nottingham. So it was definitely like, well, that's fun to have as a hobby, but you really need to be in, real estate or a solicitor or something like that. So it was, quite early on, I was quite keen to get the hell out of there.
In 1995, you made your first film, Scathed. It's a really strange and perplexing film in a good way, with kind of a noir feel to it. How did that come about, and why was it not released?
It was actually just my thesis film in film school, so it wasn't made to be a commercial film. It's also like 43 minutes long, which is a ridiculous length for a film to be. If I was a little wiser at that point, I would either have made it shorter, so that it could have played at least as a short in some festivals. Or the smarter thing to do would actually have shot a couple more weekends and made it, 75 minutes long. So ultimately I could have released it as a feature, but I didn't do either because I didn't know. And I thought it was so great that the people wouldn't mind that it was 41 minutes long, and there'd be a way to show it, which obviously there wasn't, other than beyond the film school's thesis film night and stuff like that. But ultimately it ended up being an extra.
As a thesis film, was it hard to get financed and made, or were some of the challenges in getting your first, film off the ground?
I had met a guy in school called Daryl Tucker who basically was in my film class with me, but we went to college together and we became friends, and he wanted to be the director of photography and the producer on Scathed. So he actually got a lot of the money together for the film, along with another producer called Anna Corinne Jean. She managed to raise some money too. So they actually, had a lot of faith in the project and managed to put enough money together that we were able to get it made and shoot it on 16 millimeter.
Okay.
But I made the exact same mistake on my first film. I wrote and directed my first film back in 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
35 minutes long, and that was the main reason why I didn't get into most of the festivals.
Yeah, and it sucks because basically, but if you know anybody who programs for film festivals, you know, if they program the shorts block, they have a lot of films to watch. So if something's 35 or 40 minutes long, it better be amazing in the first, you know, few minutes, or they're probably not going to make it through the whole 35, 40 minute. And that doesn't mean the film's bad. It's just like, it's not really going to fit in a short film block, you know, because it's going to take up half the runtime of the short film block. So it's really not a good length of time. It's best as an extra on a future feature.
After Scathed, you have a lot of credits on short documentary films, on like a lot of documentary shorts. How did you transition from narrative filmmaking to documentary filmmaking?
Well, I went back to England. I went to film school in the US, and then my visa ran out, so I went back to England. And I continued working for a guy, a kind of low-budget video distributor in Nottingham. And I continued working for him. And he started to pick up video equipment so we could produce kind of local PSAs and stuff like that. And he's like, we've got this video equipment, we've got an edit suite, make something. And so it seemed like doing a documentary was the best thing to do. There weren't red cameras in the 90s and stuff like that. So making a narrative film with no money with video equipment didn't seem like a smart thing to do. But making documentaries seemed like it could work. You know, you could make something that could be commercially released. And so I made a couple of local interest documentaries, like, you know, Nottingham during the war and old Nottingham movie theaters and stuff like that. And it came to me, you know, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed interviewing people. I enjoyed putting a story structure to it. And then when Carl and I, my school friend who I was into horror movies with, we started a company called Blue Underground in the UK. And we had a label called Exploited, which released horror movies. And we started to put interviews on these VHS releases. So there was extras on the VHS releases. At the end of the movie, there would be a little interview with the filmmaker or the distributor or the producer or something like that. And then that led to me doing a feature documentary on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre called Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Shocking Truth, which was released as a standalone on our label originally. That was kind of my first, you know, feature that went out. And Bill Lustig in the US saw that, the director of Maniac and Vigilante and Maniac Cop and stuff like that. He saw that. Actually, he was in it, but he when he saw that, he was doing the special editions for Anchor Bay Entertainment for the DVDs, as DVD was just beginning to become huge, and they needed somebody to make extras for them. So he basically hired me to do a documentary on The Wicker Man. He really liked the documentary that I did on The Wicker Man. He brought me over to the US, and basically I became his special features producer. And then he went and formed Blue Underground US. I stayed with him for about 4 years before we broke off and formed Severin.
Mike and I actually met Bill Lustig one time. He was a very nice guy. What was it like working for him or coming up under him?
For me, it was great. I mean, he's an absolute mentor to me because he really liked what it was that I was doing on the special features. And he gave me a lot of free rein to come up with the ideas of what we should do on a given film. Like he wouldn't necessarily have wanted to do a full documentary on the Emmanuel films, for example. But I was like, we should get the director, we should get Sylvia Crystal, who played Emmanuel, you know, and I can go to Paris and shoot this, you know. And although it was Anchor Bay's money that he was spending, to be fair, but he was definitely open to it because he saw the value in getting these first-hand recollections from filmmakers about the making of these films. This was the time when there wasn't that much stuff out there of people actually on camera talking about the making of these kinds of movies. There was stuff about the making of Superman and Star Wars and stuff like that, but there really wasn't that many documentaries about the making of exploitation and popular genre films. So, you know, and he was licensing Dario Argento and Fulci movies and all this kind of stuff. So we would go to Rome and interview all these, you know, great filmmakers, many of whom are not with us anymore. And I'm so glad that we did. I mean, we had a great time going around Europe and interviewing all these amazing people. But more importantly, we were able to put together these kind of short documentaries and sometimes long documentaries about the making of these movies and stuff that you know, on some of these films you just can't do anymore because the people are no longer with us. So it really was a very productive time. It was really fortunate that DVD really kind of blew up, so that we were able to justify, you know, making a feature-length documentary about the Mondo Cane films, for example, or a documentary about Joe Spinell, you know, things like that. That really, you know, there was no home for these kinds of projects before DVD. But now that DVD was popular, it was like we can actually expend a certain amount of money on getting these films and making a proper documentary, whatever length it may be.
When you did your first feature-length documentary, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Shocking Truth, it was after you met Gunnar Hansen at a film fair.
Yeah.
So when you approach it, how much would you say is in the writing of the questions and the narration, and how much is in the editing, and how much just springs up unexpected in the filming?
Well, it kind of depends. I mean, in the case of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Shocking Truth, because I had access to this video equipment, Gunnar was over for a festival, I think it was called Cine XS, and I just asked the owners of that, can I interview Gunnar? And Gunnar agreed. And I'm like, I've got video equipment, so I may as well interview him. I didn't know what it was for. But, you know, it wasn't often that somebody like Gunnar Hansen was in England, you know. So I got the interview with him, and we became friendly then, you know, not like close friends, but we started talking after the interview. And I said, wouldn't it be cool to do a documentary about the making of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? The only one that there is was called The Family Portrait, and it just had the people who played the family in the film. And it was, you know, it wasn't a full documentary about the making of the movie and the journey the film took afterwards. So I was like, we should make that documentary. You know, we should try and get Toby Hooper and Bob Burns and Marilyn Burns and all these people who were involved in this, to me, one of the greatest films ever made. Because it didn't seem like there was that much first-hand information about it, which seems strange now because there's a zillion documentaries and articles and everything and commentaries and everything on Texas Chainsaw Massacre now. But at the time, it didn't seem like there was that much information of how this unique masterpiece came to be. And Gunnar was essential in that because he put me in touch with quite a few of the key players. And most of them out of the film industry, you know, Paul Partain, Bob Burns, again, Bill Vale, all these people were like, okay, I guess so. You know, I paid everybody a nominal fee to talk about it because famously people didn't get what they deserved from their points in that movie, and it's covered in the documentary. So, but you know, I didn't have any money at the time. I did it on a credit card, and I had a friend's camcorder. I couldn't take the professional equipment from the office, not because my boss wouldn't allow it, it's because it was fucking massive back then. You know, it's like I'm going to basically, you know, with hand luggage or you know, one check bag or whatever it may be, and staying on my sister's floor, and I took a friend with me, and that's how we made the movie. And it was a very fortunate first feature project because there were so many unique stories about the making of that film. You know, not least the 25-hour dinner scene and the horrors that went into actually creating that amazing sequence in the film. And then the whole thing about the mafia buying the film and it just being taken out of the hands of the filmmakers, all that kind of stuff. The fact that there's so many things were a happy accident, but obviously these youths knew what they were doing in one way or another, because you don't just accidentally make a masterpiece like that, you know? There was a lot of youthful exuberance, but also just the elements that were around them at the time that just made it such a horrendous experience. It definitely seeped into the movie. All that stuff just basically, a lot of it came together while we were shooting it. As you start interviewing people, you know you have your basic structure when you go into it. You know, you do as much research as you can with the information that's out there, but then you draw out other new stuff as you interview people. So you know, that starts to kind of change the shape of the documentary often. And usually that's a good thing. Usually if you're getting new information and you get to follow that lead, then you actually know that you've got a documentary that's actually saying something that hasn't been said before.
So you didn't approach it wanting to explore the more shocking elements of the production that just came up in the interviews then?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think I knew a certain amount of it, just from having done the interview with Gunnar. But yeah, certainly the way that people had such vivid memories, it's kind of like the Richard Stanley documentary I did. When you have such a unique creative experience like that, good or bad, it sticks with you, and you have stories that you tell people, and so they're stories that are fresh in your mind even years later. Maybe the way that you've told them as opposed to the way that they actually happened. But still, it's something that, that people can actually, lend a certain validity to when they're actually telling the story back to you, as if they're telling it to you for the first time.
Was it a challenge? Because it seems like you started off like you wanted to do narrative films, if I'm correct. Yeah. Was it a challenge to switch over to documentary filmmaking? Or was it an easy switch? It was a challenge
because I was happy to be making anything, honestly, and particularly when it changed. Like even the second documentary I did even the first documentary I did for the Nottingham guy, the one about Nottingham during the Second World War, not necessarily a subject I would have picked for myself, but when I started talking to the people, I knew I had something that these people had stories to tell, and I knew that I could make, and it's very amateurish when I look at it now because it was like the first thing that I did. But I could tell as I was interviewing these people, had a story to tell that I experiences that I could never imagine, and to be honest, fuck all happened in Nottingham during the war. They had blackouts and stuff like that. There was one night of bombing. It wasn't like London or Coventry or stuff like that where there was serious, mayhem and carnage. But still, everybody was living through an experience where they had to, have blackouts and light oil on fire to cover the city in black smoke so they couldn't see it from the sky. Stuff like that I could never imagine. So even then, I was happy to be getting that information, knowing that I could put it into a format that it was actually, a narrative when I put it all together. So once I moved into making documentaries about the films that I loved, I had no problem with that. And that's being paid to go and meet your heroes and talk to them about the films that you've loved for years. That's a pretty easy job. But I also always treated it very seriously. I wanted this stuff to actually look like documentary shorts or documentary features where they weren't just kind of fluff pieces where people were saying nothing. There is kind of now quite a lot of special features which are just full of people saying nothing, or I don't remember that person, or yeah, maybe that happened the way that you said it. And so they leave it in it, and it drives me insane. It's just there's no reason for something not to be. If there's only 5 minutes worth of material, only put 5 minutes of worth of material in the thing. Don't stretch it out to 30 minutes. The poor sod sitting there going like, yeah, I don't really remember that person.
When you do these filmmaking documentaries, do you feel that studio abuse of up-and-coming filmmakers is kind of a running theme through these type, especially the ones about indie and low-budget horror films?
There's definitely quite a common theme of people, really having fun while they're shooting it, and then when it becomes successful, disappointment that it doesn't turn into money. That happened quite a lot, and because often we're talking about movies that are 30, 40 years old, if we're still talking about them, then they had some level of success. And often if they're not union pictures, then there are no residuals on those things. But usually when people agree to do it, it's either because they've got a bone to pick, but more often it's because they actually want to talk about the fact that they were part of something that's lasted. And that's actually more important for the most part for people than the fact that they didn't get, the remuneration that they thought they should get.
Yeah.
All of your work working on documentary films and working with Bill Lustig, is this what led you to, I guess, to try to form your own distribution and production company, SEVERIN Films?
Yeah. Now, Bill, I still do work with Bill actually from time to time. Bill's still running his label, but he's a lot less prolific than he was when he had a full office of people, and he prefers it that way. I mean, it was, you know, Bill's, you know, to put it mildly, has something of a temper on him, and so basically when he's when he's in a stressful situation, it tends to lead to stress for the people around him, right? Mm-hmm. I rarely got directly into a fight with Bill. There were a couple of times, but there was definitely, you know, a heavy stress. So it already seemed like, you know, I should probably break away to do my own thing, even if I'm still making extras for Bill. I should be doing it under my own umbrella, because they, you know, to basically, he by the end, he wasn't particularly happy having all the people on payroll, you know, having to feed the beast of release all these movies, because Bill's very, I understood Bill better than somebody who isn't really into these movies, because all his mania was usually to do with making things perfect, and he would get very frustrated if things weren't perfect. But you know, that shouldn't necessarily seep into you know, the other stuff that's going on in the office. So basically, me and John Cregan, who were working at his office, had been talking for a while about the fact that Bill was kind of winding down. He was getting too frustrated with the amount of stuff that he was having to put out, and maybe put out, you know, and making it perfect to try and get stuff out every month. It was impossible. So we'd been talking for a while about, you know, there was a certain subgenre of movies that wasn't being really exploited by the genre labels, and there were a lot of genre labels in the first decade of the 2000s, and that was sexploitation. There was not that many people would dabble in one or two maybe, but there were so many commercial films that had played on Skinamax and HBO and stuff like that, and John was particularly into these movies from when he was growing up here in the US. Felicity being one of them, and then Gwendolyn was one that I tried to get Bill to get for years, because although it's a kind of a hokey, you know, Indiana Jones ripoff movie, comedy movie, it's this huge budget French film that's like really not suitable for kids, you know, because it's got a sort of S&M elements and nudity and stuff like that, but it's such a handsome production. Plus it's directed by the guy who did Emmanuel and the Story of O, and it stars Tawny Kitaen from the Whitesnake videos. I was like, this film has to be commercial, right? Bill was not interested. So I ended up tracking down the rights to the film. Bill's still not interested because it was kind of expensive, because it was such a big movie in France. So me and John and Carl, my partner in England, we pooled our resources and decided to buy the rights to Felicity and to Gwendolyn first. And Gwendolyn came out and it was immediately successful. Felicity then came out a couple of months later. That also was very successful. We were extremely lucky that our first two films were successful, because, you know, so many of them aren't. Certainly not, you know, runaway successes where they, you know, make their money back in the first few days of release or pre-release. So that set us on our way, basically. And there wasn't much of a conflict with Bill at the time. In fact, there wasn't really any conflict with Bill at the time, because we were concentrating on sexploitation stuff at first, and so it wasn't like we were taking his business away from him. And so that's kind of how it started, and then it just evolved into doing more horror and genre stuff, because that's just the stuff that I'm more passionate about.
Well, Severin Films has been successful for quite a few years now. So could you tell us about the evolution from VHS to DVD to Blu-ray, and how that affected your business and how you had to adjust your strategy for each medium?
Yeah, the VHS stuff we did in England wasn't very successful. I mean, Carl and I wanted to buy rights to movies in England, but in England it's impossible because you have censorship for a start. So the kind of movies that we wanted to do were always going to be censored, and therefore doing a label which specializes in definitive editions is just a non-starter, you know. Plus it's a small market over there, you know. There's not that many places where you can sell this stuff, and plus you have to, for every film you release, you have to pay the censors essentially a giant tax to be allowed to release a movie in the UK, which you don't have to do here. So as soon as I got brought over to the US by Lustig, I jumped at the chance. I was like, this is, I'm never going to be able to make a living releasing VHS in the UK. I'll have to do something else. But then when I came over here and then got a visa and stuff, and then I was able to basically, I was able to see, the high end of the DVD business when it was really successful, when we were working at Anchor Bay, because, pretty much anything that they released would sell a good enough amount of units that it was worthwhile, and they were investing, decent budgets into the extras. And at the same time, I was still doing extras for other labels like Warner Brothers and Anchor Bay UK, stuff that had nothing to do with Bill. I basically would do independent works as well. So that happens, and then all my years at Blue Underground, it was still the DVD era. It was still the DVD era when we did when we started Severin. And then when Blu-ray started to come in, I'm trying to think what our first Blu-ray title was. Maybe it was Inglourious Bastards or Hardware. It was one of those. It was definitely one of the bigger titles, which is about to happen again with UHD. Basically, it was worth us taking the plunge and spending the extra money in creating a Blu-ray. And in that case, you would do a Blu-ray and a DVD in the same package, so that if you didn't have a Blu-ray yet, they might buy it with a view to maybe getting a Blu-ray eventually, but not purchasing something that they couldn't watch, which again is how Vinegar Syndrome is how doing their UHDs, and it's probably how we're going to do our first UHDs as well. But Blu-ray never completely replaced DVD in terms of the amount of units sold. I mean, I think people got people were so impressed with the upgrade from VHS to DVD. It just seemed like people started wanting to have a movie collection at home in a way that they hadn't done so much during the VHS era, apart from, the hardcore VHS fanatics like myself. But for DVD, everybody started getting DVDs or giving DVDs as gifts on holidays and things like that. When it upgraded to Blu-ray, people were a lot slower to kind of catch on. It didn't catch on nearly as quickly. People were satisfied with DVD, and then so when Blu-ray came in, those numbers never reached the dizzy heights that they had when they're in DVD. But it's reached a decent plateau now that's been the same for the last couple of years, whereby we rely on a collector's market that are as passionate as we are about this stuff, and they want a good edition or the best edition available of a given movie. So it's still, a worthwhile endeavor. The physical media aspect is certainly not dead yet.
What is the selection process that you go through for the classic films that you distribute? Is it movies that you choose, or how do you decide?
Well, there's about 10 of us in the Severin team at the moment. And a lot of it, I want to say the majority of it comes through me either tracking something down or something being brought to me. But there are plenty of examples where somebody in the team is like, hey, you should check out this movie, particularly with the Intervision titles, which is stuff that I probably have never seen or heard of. But the lads in the team who are about a decade younger than me or more, they grew up obviously a decade later than I did, and so the movies like the Sledgehammers and things like that they will have seen at a certain age that made a great impression, and they're like, it's worth doing. And I like doing the Intervision titles because there's no remastering involved. The licenses are a lot less, they sell a lot less, but the whole time and investment in the films is so much less than it is with the film source movies that we do and Severin. But often it's we're always on the lookout for stuff, and it seems like we have about a year and a half's worth of material on the shelf at the moment, waiting for us to dust off and make pristine and do the extras and bring out a special edition of.
So since you specialize in these special collector's editions, do you think that's why you remain successful even though the popularity of physical media has declined?
I don't know, but I would like to think so. I would like to think that our that we put out a superlative enough edition of whatever movie it is that we do, that there's enough people out there that want it. And I think we have reached a level now where we have enough people who follow what we do, that, you know, as long as we put out something that's genre related or has some aspect that falls into the kinds of films that we do, that enough people are going to want it, that it's worthwhile.
Your first full-length movie was Plague Town. What prompted you to get back into feature filmmaking after years of working as a documentarian and a label head?
It was something that I'd been talking about all the years in between, basically, between Scathed and Plague Town. Was that something that I wanted to do? And I talked about it a lot with Lustig. Lustig saw some opportunities to maybe get into, you know, feature production himself, but it never really happened. And a certain amount of it was the fact that I didn't have anything ready to go. I had plenty of, you know, ideas or you know, if you tell me you can get the money together, I'll put together a project that we can do. But that's not the way that it works. You need to have projects ready to go, you know. And I know that means a lot of work needs to go into something that might never happen, and that's often a big part of, you know, why some people just never get around to doing that script or making that script presentable. But John, who was my Severin co-founder, along with Carl, he was working as an editor with me at Blue Underground, and he was he had a lot of energy and a lot of creativity. And I told him that this is what I wanted to do. And he was like, you know, you got to stop whinging about it and you got to do it. What would it be that you would do? And I had several sort of ideas and things like that. But one thing I did have was a script that I'd written in England in the late 90s for a short film called Come Out and Play, which was essentially the middle section of Plague Town. But it's just the bit with Jessica and Robin, the English guy and the blonde girl. And all the way through to when he gets hung up by his eyes. So it was that, but just those two characters, and they go into the house and meet Rosemary, and then all the kids come and blah, blah. So that I actually had where it was something that could actually, was a starting off point. So John actually took that script, took it home, a couple of weeks later came back with like the first half of the script, which I thought was terrible. And I said, no, this is completely wrong. And I went off and then rewrote that, and then he does that, and I was like, yeah, that's not quite there. So he took it, and, you know, we never actually sat down and wrote together. We would discuss a lot of stuff together, but we never actually sat with the typewriter and one of us like walking behind the other, like, this is that idea. It never happened that way. Basically, we would give each other a draft or a section and then correct each other's work or try and make each other's work, you know, better. And ultimately that's how the script came together. So the script was done while we were still working at Blue Underground. And at the same time, I was doing extras for MPI in Chicago. So I'd done a documentary on Henry, Portrait of the Serial Killer for them. I was working on a feature-length documentary on the making of Baraka, the non-narrative documentary film. And I'd done a lot of stuff with them. They'd licensed Texas Chainsaw because they were the owners of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And anyway, they wanted to get back into production. The only features that they'd made were Henry 2, and I think Death Spa. I think they were involved in that one somehow, but I'm not quite sure. But Henry had been something of a success. Henry 2 had been a disaster. And so they'd just given up after that. But because, you know, they wanted to expand, they wanted to get into production, and they wanted to form this horror movie making company called Dark Sky Films. And it turned out through one thing led to another, and basically Plague Town ended up being Dark Sky Films' first production. As
you said, you co-wrote the movie with John Cregan, your longtime collaborator, and also consulting producer was Carl Daft. But you also had another longtime collaborator, Mark Raskin. He did a phenomenal score on this film. So how did you first end up working with him on your first film? Do you meet him in school?
Yes, I did. I met him in college, and so he did the music to Scathed. And the previous film that him and Daryl did called Till Death, which was like a 8-minute short. And Mark is an incredibly talented, I want to say noisemaker as opposed to musician, although he is a musician, but he's very good at creating, you know, soundscapes. And we got into all kinds of trouble together as friends, and we're still best friends to this day. But often it was, we would discover music together when we were in college, or introduce each other to music and stuff like that. So we had a lot of similar tastes and interests. But he's one of those people who can sort of pick up an instrument and find a way to play it, just by sitting with it, that kind of thing. Not become a master of it, but find a way to, make a good sound so that it can be, used in a film or in a soundtrack or something like that, or in his case, in some kind of soundscape that he would have in his apartment. He often had that. You'd walk into his dorm room or his apartment, and he had all kinds of strange lights, strange posters, fluorescent shit around, and noises that were coming around that were very unnerving. So he was perfect to be the person to create the soundscapes to play down. And we did it. He lives in New York and I live in LA, and we did it long distance. And basically it was, he would just send me stuff, and, and he had and still has a day job. He's a real estate guy in New York, but he loves still making music, and he's still very good at it. So, whenever I need anything, like the bumper for the Severin logo, for example, it's like, okay, here's the logo. I need something that sounds kind of Velvet Underground-y, and then the next day he'll come back with several comps, and I'll say that's the one, or change it a bit. So anyway, he worked very, very hard. He was one of the one of the key players in making the atmosphere of Plague Town, because he really created some disquieting soundscapes.
Yes, he did.
What were some of the biggest challenges on getting the film made?
The challenges on getting the film made were the fact that it was still right before digital cameras were at a stage where people were making narrative features on them and then being treated like professional narrative features. So me and MPI were keen to make this movie on film. Had it been 2 years later, in fact, I remember the assistant director coming up to me on set and saying, "Have you heard about this new camera, the Red camera?" I said, no. And so that was kind of like when that started to come in and be an acceptable camera to actually shoot professional feature films on. But at this point, that was not the case. And so there was even talk of doing it on 35 at one point, but the budget that they wanted to spend was not enough to do it even on 16, let alone to do it on 35. So we did settle on Super 16, but there was a lot of compromise in order to get the feature done for the budget that we had, and I just don't think that we should have. Actually, I'm glad that we agreed to do it, because we got the film made. But I think we might wanted to have sat down and said, okay, we need to think this through, because if we put a bit more money into it, we can make it a Screen Actors Guild film, for example, which it wasn't. And we can afford a bit more film and a bit more time, because of course all this shooting at night on Super 16 requires a lot of light and all that kind of stuff. So I think that the downside, my one big regret on Plague Town is that we didn't get enough coverage in order to have more stuff to play with in the editing room. There are certain scenes that I don't think we got enough in the can.
Could you tell us about some of the challenges of filming such a disturbing horror film that involves kids in a conservative town in Connecticut?
Yeah, it was actually fine. That side of it was absolutely fine, and I'll tell you why. Because they didn't have many film productions coming to Connecticut at the time, and so it seemed like an exciting thing to do. And so we obviously auditioned all the kids. All the parents were there, and they kind of thought it was cool. I think, as the hours went on into the night, it probably became increasingly less cool as every minute went by. But as far as the kids were concerned, they were dressing up in makeup, they were, dressing up in costume, and they were, beating up adults and blood flying around and stuff like that. So it didn't seem like it was, I don't think it was disturbing to the kids. I think it was more fun to the kids. It was probably very boring when they weren't on actually in front of camera, but I don't think there was ever I think we had enough of an atmosphere, and you'd have to ask them, but I think we had enough of an atmosphere where it was a friendly atmosphere, that it didn't seem like what you see on that it was going to be disturbing the kids. Now, a couple of the kids were quite young, like I think the youngest were like 8 years old. And I've no idea what's become of them. So maybe at some point we should. Actually, Howard Berger, who I don't know if you know who he is, but he made Original Sins, and he's made a documentary on Joe Meek. He is actually currently doing a documentary on Plague Town because we're doing a new Blu-ray. So he's actually been doing Zoom interviews over the last few weeks with people who I haven't seen since we made the movie. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see how people remember it.
So I have a question about one particular scene where Jerry's head is cut in half with a piece of razor wire.
Yeah.
How did you achieve that?
It was a mixture of practical effects and early digital effects. So the actual line across the eyes is a digital effect. The actual head sliding off, although we created the head, the top of the head bit, Tate Steinsick created the head, the effects guy. He created it, he did the body mold, or the head and shoulders mold of the actor, and then cut the top off. So we did actually have the top of the head filmed falling off the sheet of glass. And then a digital effects guy basically composited it so that it all happened in one shot. And then the body that falls to the ground is the practical Tate's effect.
Could you tell us about the conception of this iconic Rosemary character? And how did you find the perfect actress?
Yeah, I think Rosemary, Kate Aspinwall played Rosemary, and I think that's probably one of the aspects of the film that I'm most happy with, that came out better than I imagined, because I've been, due to Howard's documentary, I've been looking through a bunch of the old, paperwork and sketches and stuff that I had in pre-production, and she looks better than I had her in my sketches. She looks similar, but she looks a lot more kind of evil in the sketches. And something that I always wanted with the kids in the movie was that I wanted them still to look have a certain innocence about them. And when Kate came in to the audition, when all the kids were coming in, it was pretty obvious right away that she would be good for Rosemary, even though she was a little younger than I had in mind for the actress, knowing that a lot more would have been expected of this particular actress than a lot of the other kids who had to do more just kind of physical running around and throwing stuff and jumping and stuff like that. She actually had to play a character. Well, it's not fair. They all had to play a character, but she had to play a more complex character, should we say? Yeah. Even though she didn't speak, and of course she had to be blind. She had to be blindfolded through the whole thing. But I don't know. When I spoke to her, she was. I think she was 13 when we interviewed her. I think she was 14 when we shot. But she had done a bit of modeling, I think, and she seemed very comfortable with herself, didn't seem fazed. She was kind of shy, but not fazed about what needed to be done. And her mum was also very cool and very encouraging of her being in the film and stuff like that. And so when we brought her in, and Tom Lucier, the production designer, bought the actual lace that formed her eyepiece. So he did it to actually somehow coincide with the way that he decked out the whole kitchen and the outfit that the grandmother wore and stuff like that. So this lace that he had was the first thing. It wasn't just a piece of silk or something like that. It was very elegant. And then Tate was the effects guy was the one who actually came up with the eyeballs. Possibly because he didn't quite understand. I didn't describe to him well what it was that I wanted, but he came with these glass eyeballs and put them on the lace. And when we put them on Kate, it was like, that's perfect. That's better than I wanted it to be. And of course, on camera, it looked fantastic. And the way that she moved, there was certain amount of it was out of necessity because she couldn't see. She had to feel her way around, but she just had this very elegant way of moving that it was almost like she was a dancer or something. I don't know if she was, but she had an elegant way of moving in and out of frame that really kind of brought the character to life.
So you shot at that small town in Connecticut. Well, that's one of the best things about the movie is the way that the location seems very remote and isolated. How did you decide on that that particular location? Did it involve a lot of scouting, or did you always know you?
It did. And originally we were going to shoot, the film was written to be shot in Ireland. And I had written it to be shot in Ireland because I had a friend in Ireland who had just made a zombie movie. And he was like, I can get money for movies. And the zombie movie was it. There was no more money, but it wasn't his fault. That's just the way it goes. You know, the zombie movie didn't take off, and that was that. So we basically had to find an alternative. And my friend Daryl, who I made Scathed with, lived in Connecticut. And he said, you know, come out to Connecticut for a weekend. Let's drive up and down the state and see if it looks like what you want. And sure enough, it was a very rainy weekend. And we had a great time looking at fields and, you know, trespassing on property and stuff to try and find, you know, the look that I wanted. But this is a good example of my naivety at the time, because it could actually have been done, a lot of it could actually have been done in the back garden of where we all stayed when we were making the film. But because I was like, no, it needs to look this way, you know, 360 degrees, we ended up just traveling far and wide around Connecticut in order to get, you know, certain sequences in certain places, which probably wasn't necessary. We could actually have minimized that and saved ourselves a lot of time with company moves and working on farms which are not particularly production friendly to haul all the gear, you know, into the middle of a field and stuff like that. So, but the bottom line was Connecticut did double perfectly well, although we did take Ireland specifically out of the script. Any reference to it, you know, people saying we are in Ireland, you know, we took that out of the script just because, you know, then in order to not call attention to the fact that we were not in Ireland.
Okay.
Well, there's this sequence in the movie that's I'm very fascinated by, and I'd like to know everything that you're willing to tell me about this scene. It starts with the innocent kids in a sewing circle, and then you realize what they're sewing is they're sticking branches between this guy's eye sockets and hanging him by the eyes from a tree. I want to know how you conceived that idea, how you executed it, and what it was like trying to get that done on such a low budget feature.
Yeah, two of my favorites. It's actually split into 3 separate scenes in the movie, but they're 3 of my favorites, including the way Mark did the music. He actually developed a piece that kind of got more and more perverse as it went along in the 3 sequences. And the writing of it, actually, those scenes I believe are in Come Out and Play, the short film that I originally wrote. So that actually dates back to the original concept of the short film. And I don't know, it's just that I wanted the kids to see what they were doing to these outsiders as just kind of their fun. That's how they play. That's the toys that they have. You know, that's an acceptable way for them to entertain themselves. You know, but it's also productive because it keeps the nosy Parkers from outside from, you know, interfering in their business. Yeah. But the actual shooting of them was the middle part where they actually have Robin down on the floor in the sewing circle was something of a tense situation because it was raining that night, as it did quite a few of the nights. And we had all these kids, and I think it might have even been a school night, and it was getting very, very late. And the parents wanted to get the kids home. And so I think it was one of those things that I wish we'd have done more on the film, actually, because the director of photography always wanted everything to be lit perfectly, as the director of photography should, but that takes time. But in this one, it's like, if we don't get this sequence, this is a key sequence in the movie. And so he got something called a monkey brain, which is basically a kind of ball of Christmas lights on a stick. And basically we were out and they basically hung it over the kids in the circle, and it gave just this kind of warm glow, and it just looked magical, and it all came together in a very short amount of time. I want to say it was like half an hour. We were in and out of the place, including, you know, having special effects and blood pumping and all that kind of stuff, and it just was one of those things that really worked. And you know, when we got the footage back, it's like, okay, I've definitely got at least one scene that's exactly what I want it to be, if not better. And then the hanging from the tree was a similar situation. And again, rookie mistakes. We left the hanging to the end of the night because we wanted to give time for Robin to be made up, or James to be made up as Robin, with his eyes all mushed and with twigs sticking out of them. But the scenes before that were shot on that night, which is the stuff by the tree where Jessica's tied by the tree and then Molly comes and they fight the two kids and kill them. Took way longer than expected. So all of a sudden we're almost out of our day and the sun's about to come up. And if the sun's about to come up, then, you know, there's no shooting. It's not night anymore, you know, when you're outside. So again, we had to do that last bit very, very quickly of James hanging up by his eyes. But it really did, you know, it was one of those things when you saw it, it really looked spectacular of him with the harness on him and it actually hanging there, you know, with like tons of blood and big, black, thick Lucio Fulci type blood on his face was exactly the way I wanted. And then these four girls dressed up in character. They were, apart from the girl who played Rosemary, Kate was still only 14, but the others I think were more like 16, so it wasn't quite as bad that they were up so late. But they were just oblivious. They're like, what the hell are we doing here? You know, there's a guy hanging over there, we're supposed to throw shit at him. Okay, it's 5 a.m. Yeah, so, but anyway, all of that stuff, I was pretty happy with how it eventually came out, even though we got to it pretty late.
What were some of your influences on Plague Town? What films and what directors do you think influenced the style of this movie?
I should know this because there's definitely some, but I don't know. I was definitely looking to, you know, fairy tales and stuff like that. But I also really like movies that have disturbing imagery that's beautiful. So, like Peter Greenaway's films have very disturbing imagery in them, but they're immaculate to look at. You know, David Lynch is another one. But I would think in horror, probably Dario Argento's Phenomena was probably the one that I think of as in that vein, because again, it's got like a lot of kind of stuff happening in the woods and you know, deformed child and stuff like that. So I think there was elements of that seeped into Plague Town. I'm trying to think. There must be others, but I can't remember.
There's another parallel with this movie with my movie. I've done the movie I told you before. I'd done my first movie a couple years after that in 2010. Yeah. And you got some people from Los Angeles Recording School to work on some of the sound, and Nick Hurtado was one of them, and he actually did the sound on my movie.
I had a lot of people working on the post-production sound on Plague Town, which was really good. Like, aside from the stuff that Mark did, I had a chap called Eric Jolly who did the sound design, and he worked with me at Post Haste Digital. I didn't work at Post Haste Digital, but they did a lot of the restoration and sound sweetening on a lot of the films that we put out for Anchor Bay. So he basically had a home studio, and he would bring in people to do Foley and effects work and stuff like that. So I think that's probably how that worked, because you know, and he even brought in some other musicians to do you know, bits and bobs that to fill in gaps that Mark just simply didn't have the time to do.
I personally feel that Plague Town is an extremely scary movie. So there's all these elements like the score and the effects and stuff like that, and the atmosphere, the locations. But what do you think it is? There's something else that you can't quite put my finger on, something else that makes this scary and original in an original way.
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I didn't know that many people had seen this film, and I certainly didn't know that many people admired this film. So it's nice to hear. But you know, having said that, I've met people over the years at conventions and stuff who have said very nice things about it. I just know that it didn't get a particularly wide release. You know, MPI weren't happy with the film. They moved straight onto House of the Devil after Plague Town. It certainly played in, you know, it certainly played an area. What am I trying to say? The diplomatic. I don't know. That it was an easier sell than Plague Town was. Let's just put it that way. But I mean, I really did try and create something that had some imagery in it that was unique, you know, stuff that I hadn't seen before, like deaths that I hadn't seen before. I was always somebody who was impressed by a spectacular death in a horror movie that I hadn't seen before, so I tried to do a few of those. Creepy kids, I've always found creepy. Oh, that was one of the influences that I forgot to mention. There's an episode of the Hammer House of Horror called Children of the Full Moon, which was definitely an influence on this, and particularly the character of Rosemary's grandmother as the character that Diana Dawes plays in Children of the Full Moon it was definitely an influence on that. But that episode scared the shit out of me as a kid, so that was something that very much stuck with me. But most of all, I wanted to create something that had a really thick atmosphere, and that's something that you could actually feel the atmosphere as you were watching the movie. And hopefully I was able to build that so that when something happens, it kind of makes you unnerved. That was the idea.
I think what makes the movie effective is it takes a lot of elements that are kind of familiar, you know, and like I see kind of some, I mean, I personally see some kind of Argento influence on it, especially the way that the deaths are staged, the creepy children aspects, the isolated aspects, but it brings it together in a way that I don't think I've ever seen in a horror movie before. It combines a lot of familiar influences into something original, and I really enjoyed it. And Mike is actually the one who showed me it when I first started hanging out with Michael. He sat me down and said, we need to watch Plague Town. I need to show this movie. I can attest he shows that movie to everybody who walks into his house.
Well, that's great to hear. Thank you, Mike. How did you see it?
I had just discovered it. I was just looking for it. I seen Rosemary on the cover, and I was like, this looks weird, and I love the name, so I just checked it out. And I love low budget horror films with a lot of imagination. And I could just tell by the name and the cover that it had imagination, and it has it in spades. And I loved it so much. And like James said, ever since I saw it, everyone who walks into my house has to see it.
Excellent. Now, do people usually share your views, or are they like, ugh, when is this thing going to get going?
Most people like it.
Yeah, pretty much everyone I've showed it to really liked it and were really freaked out by it.
Excellent. All right. Well, that's very pleasing. You've made my day.
Yeah, that's good. So in 2011, you made Forget Everything You've Ever Seen, The World of Santa Sangre. Mm-hmm. So how did you go about talking to Alejandro Jodorowsky? What was it like to talk to him, and what made you choose Santa Sangre to release for Severin?
Santa Sangre is one that I've been trying to track down the rights to for years. They had been tied up for many years, even from Blue Underground, even maybe back into Anchor Bay. It was a very sought after title for labels to want to release. And I just kept on it. And there was a guy in Rome called Lars Bloch, who is actually Scandinavian, but he lives in Rome. And he just kept saying, soon, we're getting it sorted, soon. And I just stuck with it while other people fell by the wayside. So eventually we got the rights to Santa Sangre. And it was a major, major acquisition for us, because it was really, you know, well, first of all, it's a spectacular film and probably my favorite film that we've put out. But secondly, it was kind of like brought us up another level in terms of the kinds of films that we could do. So when we did that and we got the film transferred, obviously we wanted to approach Jodorowsky in order to be involved, which, you know, I heard that he could be difficult to get. But he wasn't that difficult. I mean, there was a negotiation involved, but basically, and fortunately, he was coming to New York for something, so I was able to shoot him in New York at Mark Raskin's house. Actually, that's Mark Raskin's apartment where Jodorowsky is interviewed.
Oh, cool.
You know, and he was great. I mean, he's very proud of the movie, but he rarely talks about it in interviews, which is weird, because I personally think it's his best film. But I love The Holy Mountain and El Topo as well. But this one I really think just comes together as a piece of filmmaking. But anyway, he was open to it. He gave us a terrific interview. I want to say he would talk to us for about 2 hours, and then he got up, off he went. That was it. Last I heard from him again until about 6 months ago, because now we're doing the 4K of Santa Sangre. And he basically wrote to me saying, I heard you've done a 4K, I need to approve it, which I said, great. And then he's like, well, I need to get into a color room in Paris, and you need to pay me and all this kind of thing. And but you know, it's Alejandro Jodorowsky, that's fine, he's doing the work. The problem is that then the COVID happened. So basically we have not been able to have that color session done yet. It's still supposed to happen, but when, who knows?
Alejandro Jodorowsky is a very fascinating individual. He's a novelist. He writes his own movies. He's a poet, a playwright, an essayist, a theater director, a shaman, a comics writer, a puppeteer, a mime, a psychologist, a spiritual guru, a painter, and a sculptor. Yeah. When you met him, did he, I'm not trying to sound superstitious, but did he have like a certain kind of aura or an air of mystery about him when you met him?
No, but he's very domineering. He's an incredible presence, you know, okay. and you know, a lot of the questions that I have, he is going to lead into a story, you know, the story that he wants to tell. And that's fine, because most of his stories are fascinating, you know, and that's what we want to hear. So yeah, I mean, he's a very, I would just say he's a very dominant presence. You know, you're in the presence of somebody who's a great artist. But to go back to your previous question about Forget Everything, once we got Alejandro, I was like, okay, I haven't seen or heard of an interview with anybody else from the making of this film. It was kind of like that Texas Chainsaw thing, where it was like there was not enough information out there about the making of this film, and that maybe is part of, you know, what makes it so special. It just seems like, where did this film come from, you know? But I wanted to know, so that's when we started, you know, tracking down. Sergio Arau, who's a director in his own right. He made A Day Without a Mexican, and he's also kind of a rock star in Mexico as well. He lives in Los Angeles, and he did the tattoo art on Thelma Tixu. He actually painted the tattoos on her body. And he's also a cartoonist, quite a famous a satirical cartoonist as well. So he's also a multifaceted artist. A lot more approachable than Alejandro. He's like, oh, come into my house, let's talk, da, da, da. Well, he put me in touch with his daughter, who still lives in Mexico City. And through her and her connections, she was able to find, you know, Thelma Tixu and Blanca Guerra and various people who were in the movie. So we were able to get a lot of people. And then Jodorowsky's sons, one of them was in Paris, one of them was still in LA at the time, now back in Mexico City. So I wanted to dig deep and get as many people as we could. And I think we did that. But funnily enough, there was also people in Rome, of course, because it was an Italian co-production. Claudio Argento produced it. But now that we're doing the 4K, we've actually found like a bunch more people that we didn't interview for Forget Everything. So we've actually got a bunch more new extras to include.
That's awesome.
That's very exciting to hear there. So in the same year, you came out with a anthology horror film that I think was ahead of its time. It's called The Theater Bazaar. And you produced it, and you also directed one of the segment suites. Yeah. So how was this anthology first conceived?
So me and Daryl were at Mark Raskin's house on New Year's Eve, drunk, and we were complaining about the fact that Plague Town hadn't quite gone the way that we'd wanted it to, and that we should try and have more control next time we make a movie. But the problem is resources. Like, I can't bash MPI because they financed the damn movie. It's their movie, and it's their decision what they want to do with it. And if they didn't particularly like it, that is their prerogative, you know. So but after that, it's like, damn, we put all this work into it, and then it just kind of sort of gets shelved, or it just gets, you know, a basic release with not much festival play and blah blah blah. That's, you know, I was much more hurt about it at the time, but now I kind of understand that that's just the way it is. If they don't think that they can market it, that's, you know, up to them. But so Daryl and I are in Mark Raskin's kitchen, and we're talking about, well, what kind of budget can we put together? And Daryl, you know, threw out a number that he thought he could get together, but what could we do that was kind of vaguely commercial? And I said, well, I interact with quite a lot of, you know, genre filmmakers with what I do with Severin. maybe we should do an anthology. There hasn't been many anthologies in recent years, particularly anthologies that have multiple directors. And one thing that I learned from the couple of festivals I did go to with Plague Town was when I met the filmmakers, one of the unifying aspects for all filmmakers is how difficult it is to get a feature off the ground. And it just seemed like if we could actually get, 5 or 6 different filmmakers to do a segment with an overriding theme, that it would be a lot easier to do. They wouldn't have to take 2 years out of their lives to do it, as you do when you're doing a feature, and a feature that sometimes doesn't get made, that's how much you spend on it. You would have to spend considerably less than that. It could also be a lot cheaper than a feature film, because that's obviously one of the big problems of narrative features, is they're extremely expensive. And so Daryl liked that idea, and then I just started reaching out to filmmakers that I'd worked with or knew through other filmmakers that I already knew, and we put the team together to make Theatre Bizarre. And that, I have to say, was in terms of its production, was a very satisfying experience. Like all the filmmakers were given the same amount of money. Only one of them went over budget, but it wasn't so much that it destroyed the budget of the movie. And everybody kind of was into it. It was like a camaraderie. Everyone wanted to kind of do as good as they could, because they're like, if that guy can do it for this amount of money, then I can do it for this amount of money, Like Buddy Giovanazzo, for example, had been working in German TV for many years, so he wasn't used to working the way he did when he made Combat Shock, but he liked making Combat Shock, and he liked all the people he was working with, so he rose to the challenge and made it work, so it was a very satisfying experience, and as a whole, it's like a lot of anthology movies. There are segments that you like and segments that you don't like, but I've seen people love every segment. Somebody has loved every segment, whether they hate that one and love that one. You know what I mean? Yeah. And then of course, like, I think, and I'm not saying that I inspired this, because I think some of the other similar anthologies were actually already in pre-production when we made Theatre Bizarre. But it seems like in the 10 years since then, there's been thousands of those anthologies that have got multiple directors. And again, I want to reiterate, I'm not saying that I opened the door for that to happen. I just think it was at a certain time where independent filmmakers, were like, we should do that while we're waiting to do our next feature. It seems like the obvious thing to do. But it was definitely one of the earlier ones in the new wave. I would say that chronologically.
Well, Udo Kier brought the whole thing together. How did you get him?
Through Buddy, actually, and we knew we wanted to get we wanted that Peter Cushing, to be as Peter Cushing is in Amicus anthologies. He's on a couple of the films. He's always the guy in the wraparound story, or how Vincent Price and John Carradine are in Monster Club, or there's like a horror person who will tie it all together, and who is there in the world who is still, who has been, played a lot of different character roles in horror. There weren't many, there's Robert Englund, I suppose, but, and again, I don't know if we even approached him, but there weren't many. It came down to kind of a short list, but Udo has played Dracula, Frankenstein, and Dr. Jekyll for a start. He's also, in Dario Argento movies, in Mark of the Devil. He has a very rich history in horror, in addition to being in Fassbinder movies and Lars von Trier movies and Gus Van Sant movies. And, the career on Udo Kier is amazing. And obviously, everybody loves Udo Kier. There's as a character, those eyes, that voice, everything. But I don't think he actually was on the short list, because we just thought he was out of our league. But Buddy had worked with him in German TV, and they had got along great. And I think they'd done a couple of films together. And they actually, every time Buddy came to the US, they would see each other, or when Udo went to Berlin, they would see each other. And so Buddy just called up Udo, and Udo was open to it. He wanted to meet me. So I drove to Palm Springs, where Udo lives, and we had a coffee and got along fine. And he came in and shot all his stuff in a day. We had to do it all in a day, and I think it was a very long day. But what was amazing was that Udo was really into it. I think, I'd heard some things that unsubstantiated things that Udo, if he's not into it, it can be quite difficult. But I did not experience that at all. He was fantastic, and it was Jeremy Kasten who actually directed him, but I was on the set, and took him out after he finished and stuff like that. But Udo's great, and Udo promoted the movie afterwards and was a gem.
One of the people that you got to work on Theater Bazaar as a director was Richard Stanley.
Yes.
Is this what led to you making the documentary Lost Soul, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley's Island of Dr. Moreau?
Yes, in a roundabout way. So we had already done hardware on Blu-ray, so that's kind of where I first really kind of professionally interacted with Richard. Mm-hmm. And I had assumed that Richard didn't want to direct anymore. That's why he hadn't directed since. But turns out that was not the case. He did want to direct, but he certainly retreated after Island of Dr. Moreau, which is a story I was kind of familiar with. I was familiar with a lot of the rumors. But no, he did want to do something. And so when I asked him, I drove to his place in Montségur in France. And one time when I was there, because my parents live in France, so I just drove from their house to Montségur and pitched the idea to him. And he said, it just so happens I have a short script we've written called Mother of Toads. And that would probably fit the bill. And I said, great, let's do it. So that was the return to narrative directing for Richard. So when we were in post-production on Theatre Bazaar, I also visited him in Montségur, and we also spent time together at festivals because we would travel around like in packs when we went to the festivals with Theatre Bazaar. Like 3 or 4 of us would go to the various festivals and show the movie. I spent a lot of time with Richard, and I would eventually got around to asking him what happened on Island of Dr. Moreau. And Richard is a man who can tell a story, as you probably know, if you've either spent time with him or seen him in any documentary. A fantastic way with words and just a great storyteller. And so I was like, we've got to record this. So, and it was, I think it was before Theatre Bazaar had come out. I went to his house with a camera, and it was very much like when I made Chainsaw. It was just me, and I put the camera on a shelf. It wasn't even on a tripod. I didn't have a tripod, and just let it roll. And several had told the whole story and got all his storyboards out and all that kind of thing. And it was while we were doing that interview that was originally just going to be like a blog post on the Severin page. I started thinking, I've got to ask other people if this is really what happened. This is too crazy. And I started reaching out to people when I got back to LA, and surprisingly, most people were like, "Oh yeah, that absolutely, I'll talk about it." So it was, some people were more difficult than others, but for the most part, people had a lot to say about that production.
Your documentary was about 20 years after the movie. And this story of what Richard Stanley went through making Island of Dr. Moreau was screaming to be told. So why do you think you're the first one to pick it up and tell it?
I think a lot of people had written off Richard, including himself, for a little while after the film. I mean, he didn't want anything to do with the film business for a while, and he was just kind of considered out of the game. And I don't think people really kind of put together just how crazy the experience was, because, while there were lots of rumors, there was never all the people talking about it the same thing at the same time. So people must have just been like, oh, they had to fire that Richard Stanley because he's crazy. That was kind of the story that went around Hollywood afterwards and kind of destroyed his career until recently. But when I heard him tell it through, like, in a way that he kind of got over it, there was no real animosity. There was still a certain amount of grudge in there, but it wasn't like angry. That was when I was like, this is the way that the film needs to be told. But I do need to get other people to corroborate what he's saying, because it could be seen as that bitter guy who's got one side of the story.
Yeah.
There's in my opinion, that is one of the most fascinating documentaries that I've seen about film production and what it's like to make a movie and the things that happen on it. Was it fun to assemble all these interviews, and did you know how much of a story you had there? Because there's a full arc that comes around all the way with Richard making his way back to the set and becoming in the movie. Did you know that the story was going to be that detailed, or did you discover that in the process of interviewing people and editing it together?
Well, because I interviewed Richard first, I certainly knew, the beginning, middle, and end.
Okay.
And a lot of the craziness that went on in between. But like I say, it was definitely getting other people to tell their side of that same story that made it into the whole. It couldn't just be the guy who went off into the woods and came back with a mask on telling the story. I needed, those guys who snuck him onto the set to corroborate what happened. That kind of thing. I certainly needed Fairuza Balk, who was like the one from the original film who ended up in the final film, to tell her side of the story, that kind of thing. And then I needed the people from the studio who were just like, I don't care what has been his vision since he was a teenager. This is our money and we need to get this damn movie made. Like, I understand their point of view as well, even though they maybe signed on to something that they didn't really think through. Once it started hemorrhaging millions of dollars, you have to do something to fix that, so I got all that as well, but so that's why it was important to get all angles. I needed to get down to the PAs and the extras in the film who lend a fantastic dimension to it, because they don't have any investment in it other than that it was like a crazy story that they were a part of for a few months. It wasn't their dream project and it wasn't their money, but they still were able to observe it from sitting in makeup for hours on end and watching what was going down. So anyway, the more people I got like that from the various different perspectives, the more it just became exciting. And it took about 2.5 years to get all the people in and jump onto the editing. And I edited it with Doug Buck, who was another one of the Theatre Bizarre directors. So there was 3 of us Theatre Bizarrians on that film.
So one of the things that I found most interesting about the documentary were the stories of the on-set behavior of Val Kilmer and the stories of Marlon Brando. And he's legendary for being difficult and kind of absurd on movie sets. Did you try to reach out to Val Kilmer for an interview for this movie?
I did. And there were a handful of people who wouldn't participate. Ron Perlman was one of the first people to knock me back. And I heard later that he saw the documentary and was actually I wouldn't say regretful that he didn't do it, but he didn't think that what I was pitching was going to be so even-handed towards Richard. And he still felt bad that I was going to be, opening old wounds for Richard. But then he wrote to Richard and said, it seems like you have a healthy perspective on the whole thing. So maybe if I'd have pitched it differently, I might have got Ron Perlman. But Val Kilmer, I approached every which possible way. And I told him that we had all these people talking about the film. I didn't necessarily say that he was the villain of the piece, but I think that was pretty much inferred by the fact that there were other people talking about what happened on the film. So I would have thought that enough time might have passed that he might be able to look back on it with, a perspective. But I never got not even the slightest response from him, not even a no. And nor have I heard from him since the film came out, or heard of him seeing the film or an opinion about it or anything.
Okay.
So since you had become friends with Richard Stanley, did you feel any frustration on his behalf while you were making it?
There was some frustration when he saw it. He like when he first saw the documentary before we premiered it, he was pissed. He was, and it's probably the angriest I've heard Richard. And he still wasn't like yelling or anything like that, because that's just not the way Richard is. But he was definitely upset that there was stuff in there that he thought was incorrect. Particularly stuff by the AD Zimmerman, or was he the production manager maybe? But anyway, he stuff that like he's lying, that kind of stuff. And I was like, well, it's important to have all the perspectives so that your story comes through. It's not just you with an opinion. Anyway, he agreed reluctantly to go along with it, and showed up at the premiere and stuff like that. And the more screenings that he went to, the more he saw people laughing and enjoying the absurdity of this story, the more he realized that it was funny and that it was something to look back on as just like the absurdity of humans, and as he often said in the Q&As, nobody got hurt, nobody died. At the end of the day, it's an absurd story where a lot was at stake in terms of money and things like that and reputations, but nobody came out harmed. You could argue that his career was harmed, but ultimately he's come back, so it's fine.
Well, for me, the documentary was two things. It was kind of heartbreaking and sad because I felt for Richard Stanley as an artist. And on the other hand...
Which I did too. I mean, I think I'd like to think that comes through, even though it's important to show the business side of it and all the other angles. But ultimately, and I tried to explain this to Richard when he first saw it, ultimately, I was on his side,
But even after that, later in the movie, I had to keep pausing it and rewinding it because some of the stories had me busting up in laughter. I could barely contain myself. So I thought that was a really good mix to bring together the perfect mixture of heartbreak and humor and combine them together for this fascinating story of a film production.
Great. I'm glad you said that. And it seems like, quite a lot of people felt that way too, because it's certainly the film of mine that's reached the widest audience and got the most acclaim. So and ultimately Richard and I, traveled with the film together and went to screenings a lot together, and it certainly increased our bond. That's led to other stuff that we've done together, and I would say like peripheral in a roundabout way led to him doing Color Out of Space. So I think all's well that ends well, as they say.
After seeing this documentary, I was just fascinated by Richard Stanley, and I was so proud and happy to see him come back in such a huge way in Color Out of Space this past year. Yeah. So you were a co-producer on that film, right? So what was your involvement in it?
So I commissioned the story initially, the script, I should say, not the story. The story's by H.P. Lovecraft. But it was also that same trip, I think, where we started Lost Soul. When I was with him in Montsegur, and Daryl was with us too. So it was during the post-production of Theatre Bizarre, or right as Theatre Bizarre was ending. And we also talked about doing a Lovecraft project because Daryl's a Lovecraft fan as well. And Daryl didn't go on to be involved any more than that. But I commissioned the script initially, and we developed it. And then several years went by of nothing happening and some people being interested but it never going anywhere. And it really only became real when we were doing the rounds with Lost Soul, because that's when Richard was introduced to the guys at Spectravision, and they wanted to do a Lovecraft project. There was obviously a marketability angle, because Richard now was kind of the star of this crazy documentary. So all of a sudden he was sort of becoming a personality again. But it really was Spectravision that were able to put the money together and actually get it made. And so essentially I sold the project to them, and they ran with it and made the film.
I thought it was awesome. It had such a unique vision
it's good.
to it.
Yeah.
Really good movie. Probably one of the most unique movies to come out this year.
Yeah. No, I mean it's amazing, isn't it? And it's sort of like, it makes you think what he might have been doing in the ensuing years, but maybe that makes you come back stronger. So it's maybe not a bad thing.
Well, exactly. A lot of credit to you, because you brought back a filmmaker who was supposed to be something, but then his career tanked. You brought him back to what he was always supposed to be.
Yeah, but he did that too. I mean, I don't want to take too much of the credit. Yeah. Like he was, I think it was always there. It just, he needed the means to actually happen. So I guess in some ways I was a catalyst to that happening. Yeah.
I just have a quick question about a short documentary that you did in 2015. I love the film State of Grace, and you made one called Directing a Bunch of Gangsters, The Making of State of Grace.
Yeah.
Where is this? Because I couldn't find it anywhere.
It's on the UK Blu-ray of State of Grace, released by Second Sight. And it's basically an interview with the director. We still do a lot of special features for Second Sight. We've just done a bunch of stuff for their huge Dawn of the Dead box that's coming out.
You also directed last year the documentary Master of Dark Shadows about the infamous television series. How did this project start? Were you a fan of Lost Shadows growing up?
Dark Shadows. No, I wasn't actually. I had never seen Dark Shadows, the TV show. I'd seen the movies. But it was my old compadres at MPI who, after Lost Soul, they wanted to do a feature documentary on Dan Curtis, and specifically on Dark Shadows, because they distribute all of the Dark Shadows and a lot of Dan Curtis's stuff. So they wanted somebody to do a documentary. I'd done Lost Soul, so they called me and said, hey, do you want to do a feature documentary on Dan Curtis? And I said yes, and that was that.
So you did another very fascinating feature-length documentary. We just watched it last night. Is Blood and Flesh, the real life and ghastly death of Adamson.
Yes.
So tell us about how this one came about, and how you got to work with producer Heather Buckley on this.
So after Lost Soul, I wanted to find another subject that was worthy of a standalone feature documentary, because I was continuing to make short documentaries and special features for extras for Severin and for other companies, but I wanted to do another feature. And I was interviewing a guy called David Connow, who wrote a book on Al Adamson for a special feature. And it became evident while I was interviewing him that this was the subject that would be the next feature. And this was about 4 years ago now, and it ended up being a over 3-year project. But not only was it because it had the true crime element, which doesn't usually happen when you're talking about B-movie directors, but it also had this, moreover, it had this cast of characters that was very colorful. Like, each of them could be worthy of a biopic of themselves, like John Bud Cardos and Graydon Clark and Zandor Vorkov and Vilmos Zsigmond and all these, and Gary Kent, all these people who, have got fascinating careers in and of themselves, all came into the orbit of Al Adamson. And so I wanted to make a documentary about the life of this guy before we go into the lurid death of this guy, because most of the story, the way the story had been told up until this point, it was basically a headline. It was basically horror movie director dies horror movie death, So the documentary starts that way and then rewinds back to, right to his childhood, basically, or before he was born, because we talk about his dad, and then takes you through his entire life and career and all these rip-roaring adventures he had in low-budget filmmaking, which, are just incredible. The people involved, but also, the lengths they went to get this stuff on the screen for no money was quite something. And so that's stuff that really excites me. But then it takes this left turn into weirdness in the last act, which also is very exciting for me because I'd never really done anything in the kind of true crime genre. So it involved dealing with police and a murder and looking at crime photos and footage and stuff like that. So that was all new to me. And Heather came on about early in the project because I needed somebody to basically find a lot of people, because a lot of people were not easy to find. Either they'd retired from the film industry or were never particularly in the film industry. But then there was also all the police and witness and family and people like that who had dropped off the radar. They'd retired from the police force. There was no way to get in touch with them. There's no IMDb for police, so she had to find all that stuff. And so she helped immeasurably in bringing all those people into it.
Was it heartbreaking to assemble this documentary together and get the interviews? Because on the one hand, it's a very fascinating documentary about B-movies, film production, adventures. It's a little piece of history. The last part is very sad and disturbing. Was it sad to actually have to put this together and interview all the people who were connected more to the crime elements of the story?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when you're interviewing police, for example, they are very kind of professional and matter of fact about what happened. They don't have an emotional investment. They can't, because it's they wouldn't be able to do the job if they did that. So they are able to piece things together in terms of what was their contribution to the solving of the crime, that sort of thing. But then, of course, you have all these people who knew Al for 50 years or whatever, so they had to go far back in their memories to recount these adventures. But once they start, they start coming back, and of course it's very sad. But for some people who knew, a lot of people had lost touch with him by the time that he was murdered. So they also just heard, they're like, that guy I worked with 2 decades ago got murdered. That's weird, And then there were other people who were deeply affected by it, like, for example, Marilyn Joy, who was in several of his blaxploitation movies in the 70s. She was still pretty angry at Fred Fulford for taking him away from us, and so there was a full range of emotions for sure. And as one person put it, it's like, how many people do you know who've been murdered? It's not something that happens regularly to people in your life. Hopefully it isn't, but it's certainly in the case of the people that I was interviewing. So it was something that they all remembered, and they all had, fresh in mind of when they heard that had happened.
I have to commend you for taking so many shifts in tone and so many elements and putting them together in such a seamless way, including the alien element. Now, during filming, you encountered an alien at a rest stop in Baker, California. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't know if that might be simplifying it a bit, but basically, after I'd interviewed Stevie Ashlock, who was the girlfriend or wife of Al when he died, she had given a very emotional interview in Las Vegas, and had told me all about the alien aspect, or not all about it, because as you see in the film, she stops herself from going too far into detail.
Yeah.
But off camera, she had told me about more detail about what aliens look like, and the fact that they're all around us, and it's kind of like a Men in Black situation, whereas that government's aware of them, but as long as they're not doing bad things, then they're allowed to exist. And she told me that one of the ways that is that you can see like a kind of deadness in their eyes, right? And we'd been talking about Al and the fact that he had this like little dog, and that he always kept under his arm. And so basically I'm on the way home from Vegas, and I'm very excited that I've got this great interview. I stop at the rest stop in Baker, which is a famous place for having alien jerky in California. And I was in the bathroom, and next to me there was this guy with sort of like dead eyes, and I was sort of laughing to myself as I was washing my hands. I was like, "Oh, I think I've run into an alien, ha ha ha." And then when I turned back around to open the door and let him out, he like turned to me, and he had these really sharp eyes, and under his arm he had like this little dog just like the one that Al had. And I was like, "Oh, that's fucking weird." And so I got the hell out of there, and that was that. I don't know for sure if he was an alien.
Did these aspects scare you when you were making the documentary and then encountering that? Did you get a little bit spooked by any of it?
The only time I got sort of vaguely spooked by it was when we actually lost a bunch of footage, which is something that doesn't happen. Like I had to interview the police and Guadalupe, the maid, the housekeeper, I should say, of Al, a second time, because I went to Indio, California to interview them all across 2 days, and that footage disappeared. And there was some dark nights as I was just going through every hard drive, as everybody I've encountered, and lent a hard drive to, which is a lot of people, because we do a lot of stuff with hard drives going all over the country. Do you have this footage? Where is this footage? And Jim, the cameraman, he always backs up his footage. He couldn't find it either. And so at that point, I was like, there's some power that's getting involved that doesn't want this film to be seen. And I even went to so drastic as being like, well, let's just cut it up and we'll just make it extras on some of Al's films, and that's that. I mean, we could never get these interviews as good again. But that was a lesson, because when we went back and interviewed them again, and Heather was the one who said, nonsense, I'll just call everybody up and we'll do it again. There was a few hurdles because one of the guys had moved to Oregon since we shot the interview, so we had to go up there to interview him. But the interviews were actually slightly better the second time because I guess after they'd been interviewed the first time, it had refreshed their memory and they'd probably thought about it a bit. So like even 6 months later or whatever it was, they had like a slightly better recollection the second time, or a slightly more succinct way of telling the story. So, you know, even if you lose the footage, it's not the end of the world.
How much can you tell us about the documentary that you're working on now, Bruceploitation?
I was shooting Bruceploitation, Enter the Clones of Bruce, it's called. And I was shooting that concurrently with Adamson and with Dark Shadows. And basically, it was a situation where whichever one's closest to the finish line is the one that's going to get finished first. And so I started it, I think, 2.5 years ago, something like that. And Dark Shadows had to be completed first because it was a job for hire and I had a deadline. Then with Bruce, there was one of the fake Bruces. Basically, after Bruce Lee died in 1973, there was a big gap in the market for kung fu films, which had suddenly, you know, boomed all over the world because of Bruce Lee. So they needed to fill this gap in the market with another Bruce Lee. Well, there aren't that many Bruce Lees out there. There's only been one, but they figured that if they cast people who look like Bruce Lee, they can make sequels or biopics or things like that and just kind of pass off these films as kind of Bruce Lee adjacent. So there was an emergence of stars like Bruce Lee and Bruce Lai and Dragon Lee and Bruce Liang and several other clones, they were called, and they made something like 500 movies over the next 10 years. And it was
500?
a whole industry. Yeah, it was huge. Yeah, there was just a ton of these movies that in some way or another had like Bruce in the title, or they were marketed like they were somehow associated with Bruce Lee. And so we went to Hong Kong and Taiwan and South Korea and interviewed various people who made these movies, including 3 of the 4 main Bruce clones. And found out like how they did it and what they knew about it, and was it exploitation and all that kind of thing. It's pretty fascinating stuff, and that's in post-production now. And the reason that was the 3rd one was because the 4th Bruce Le, or Bruce Lay, L-E, he's still around, but he's been kind of teasing us whether or not he would give us an interview, and basically he's not going to give us an interview. And so it was kind of we just kept on holding out hope that he was going to do it eventually, but he's not going to do it. And so that's too bad, but we got all the other Bruces and it's still coming together pretty nicely.
Okay. When do you think we're going to be able to see this documentary?
Hopefully by the end of the year. By the
end of the year? Okay.
Yeah. So
what drew you towards this topic? Was there anything in particular that got you interested in Bruceploitation?
Yes, we did on Severin, we did a trailer compilation called Kung Fu Trailers of Fury, 2 volumes. And it's just a bunch of trailers for Kung Fu movies, but we got a bunch of experts on Kung Fu movies to do commentary. And one of the guys, a guy called Michael Worth, his area of expertise is Bruceploitation. And it got me thinking. I was aware of Bruceploitation, and I'd been tricked into seeing Bruceploitation films when I thought they were a sequel to a Bruce Lee movie or something like that when I was in the video years. But I didn't really know much about it, and I started talking to this guy, and I was like, this is just an incredible, vast web of a vast network, I should say, of movies and people who were desperately trying to kind of fill this gap while they figured out, you know, the next direction for the martial arts genre to go in terms of the international market. There'd always been martial arts movies, and there'd always been successful martial arts movies, but in terms of a worldwide international phenomenon, it was Bruce Lee that put it on the map, and they were desperately trying to find that thing that would be able to sell these movies in every territory. And for the stopgap time, it was making these Bruceploitation movies. And this guy Michael knew everything. So he came on board as a co-producer. He came with us to Hong Kong and Taiwan and South Korea. And you know, he's the one who knows the difference between all these movies, they have so many different titles, and a lot of them have the same title internationally. So it's very difficult to. There's a lot of Big Boss 2, for example. There's at least 3 that I know of, Big Boss 2s that we know of that have. But one of them is also known as Fist of Fury 2. So it's a very complicated web that we try to untangle in the documentary.
So I wanted to ask you something I've been wanting to ask you ever since Plague Town. Do you plan on making another narrative feature? And has your experience during making your documentaries and the stories you've heard, has that contributed to the reasons why you haven't made another one?
The main reasons I haven't made another one is because they're too expensive for us to self-finance if it's going to be done in a way that I want to do it. And so, whereas making documentaries, we can self-finance. So I'm not answerable to anyone other than myself and my partners, and I quite like it that way, so that I can do them the way that I want to. And the other thing about documentaries is that you don't have to put up the money all in one go. Like I say, these films are take 2 and 3 years. So even though the budget comes to, not insignificant amount, at least it's spread over that time. So it doesn't seem like it's going to, bankrupt you in order to do it. So yes, the short answer is yes, I do want to do a narrative feature. In fact, while I've been out here in Joshua Tree, I've been writing a treatment for another one.
Great.
But we'll see if I can actually figure out a way to get it made without having to, give it all away. Which I don't know that anybody. I'm not saying that people are clamoring at my door for my next screenplay, but it would be ideal if I could do it in a way that, like I do the documentaries, where we could make it a Severin production, or at least a Severin co-production, like Theatre Bazaar was.
We actually just finished a feature film. James helped me produce it, and I wrote and directed it. It's called Pay Up, and we just entered 5 festivals. It was a tiny $4,000 budget. We filmed it in 5.5 days. So what would be your advice for filmmakers like us who are looking to make a mark in this business when it's so grueling as illustrated in your documentaries?
Yeah, I would definitely say try and get it into the genre festivals. I mean, that's been the way, the Fantasias and the Fantastic Fest and Stitches and Fright Fest, and every major country has at least one good genre festival, and often more. So you really should try all of those, because getting the film seen and finding people who like it to talk to other people about it, that's the way the films either get distribution, or if you end up self-distributing, at least you can get reviews out there and people actually talking about it, because that's the way that people get to know about your movie.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Before you go, I wanted to ask you, what are some of your favorite horror movies?
I mean, there's so many. I'm very fond of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, obviously. I like The Tenant, Roman Polanski's movie. I like Blood for Dracula, the one with Udo. I like Dawn of the Dead. What else have I got up there? Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me. I'd say that's very much a horror movie. I love that movie.
Underrated.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now that the Twin Peaks The Return happened, which is also a masterpiece, I think people have kind of reevaluated it. But at the time, people thought it was rubbish, and I always thought it was a masterpiece. What else do I love? I like Brides of Dracula is probably my favorite Hammer movie. But I particularly like horror movies going back to the silence. So I like every era of horror movies. It's rarer these days for me to see something that kind of blows me away. But there's stuff that I like. But I think up to a certain point, maybe in the early 90s, where things stopped really kind of amazing me and making me want to that's a film that I want to make, that sort of thing.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask you one more question about Severin. You guys are having a big mid-year sale this weekend. So what can we hope to see in the sale, and do you have any titles you can tell us that are coming up? Yes, we have. In the sale, we're releasing 6 new films. So we've got Fulci for Fake is a new movie, which is basically a documentary about Lucio Fulci.
And I particularly Fulci for Fake.
Yeah, Fulci for Fake, which is kind of a play on the Orson Welles film F for Fake. But I like the way that the filmmaker tried something new by the backbone of the film is about an actor who's preparing to play Lucio Fulci in a biopic, and it's him preparing for the role by interviewing people who worked with Fulci, and so that's kind of the way into the story. But then there's also like a very in-depth interview with Camilla, the late Camilla Fulci, his daughter, which is pretty eye-opening stuff. And there's also like a ton of behind-the-scenes footage which has never been released before from the set of Zombie and The Devil's Honey and stuff like that. So that's the first one. And then we've got two Fulci movies, Enigma and Demonia, which have never been on Blu-ray in the US before. Then we have two Jess Franco movies, Shining Sex and Bahia Blanca, White Bay. And then we have an Intervision title, Frankie and His Pals, which is a goofy monster mash comedy. And then we also have an upgrade of The Beast Must Die, the Amicus werewolf movie. We're reintroducing Blood on Satan's Claw because we've got a few copies left. And we have a few copies left of the Al Adamson Masterpiece Collection, which will all go this weekend. And then the rest of the catalog, if it's more than 6 months old, for the 3 days of the sale, it's 50% off.
Okay.
Very cool. I'd just like to tell you it's a tremendous honor to talk to you today. Thank you so much for coming out for this interview. And again, I love Plague Town, and I cannot wait to see what you do next.
All right, thank you very much for having me. Well, Plague Town, we're preparing the new Blu-ray. As I say, Howard Berger's putting together a shit ton of stuff for the extras. So you know, it will have a Severin edition finally.
We're going to keep the audience updated as to when that's going to come out too.
Awesome.
Yeah, I won't shut up about it.
Please.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, David.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Horror show exclusive.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it, folks. Next week, we have another interview.
This one is Jen Wexler. She's the director of The Ranger.
Currently playing on Shudder. And for anybody interested in the work of David Gregory, his feature film, Plague Town, is available for free on Amazon Prime in the US, as well as Lost Soul, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley's Island of Dr. Moreau. That's also available for free on Amazon Prime. Again, this is in the US. And if you want to check out his most recent documentary, Blood and Flesh, The Real Life and Ghastly Death of Al Adamson, you'll probably have to rent it from Amazon Prime or on demand, but it is well worth renting.
And don't forget to go to Severin Films' website this weekend for their big mid-year sale, as he mentioned, with 6 new releases. I didn't know they were going to have new releases in it, dude.
Yep, got to get that Fulci fix.
Plus, they got the 4K Plague Town coming up. So much great stuff coming up.
Yep. Well, we hope you enjoyed it. Until next week, folks, happy horror.
Happy horror.